Rinka moved through the dense jungle, her massive frame shifting between the towering trees like a shadow. At 10 feet tall, she was the largest of her tribe, larger than any Acceleran woman in generations. Her muscles rippled beneath her deep blue skin as she leaped over a fallen tree, landing with a powerful thud. The ground trembled slightly, but Rinka barely noticed. She was used to her strength. The others feared it. Far behind her, the village lights glowed softly, hidden between the thick vines and massive tree roots that made up the jungle's floor. She wasn't welcome there. Not truly. They tolerated her presence, but she was an outsider among her own kind. Too wild, too uncontrollable, too different. Rinka scowled as she reached the edge of a small stream. The water shimmered under the pale light of Solara's twin moons. She knelt and took a handful of the cool liquid, letting it slip through her fingers before drinking deeply. A rustling sound caught her attention. Her sharp, feline-like ears twitched. Her people had excellent hearing, and she could tell this was no small animal. Something large was moving through the trees. Slowly, carefully, hunting. Rinka's lips curled into a grin. She stood, stretching her arms and cracking her knuckles. If a beast was foolish enough to think she was prey, she would teach it otherwise. Then the creature leaped from the shadows. A Acceleran night beast, four-legged, covered in dark scales, with eyes that gleamed like molten gold. It was fast, but Rinka was faster. As it lunged, she sidestepped, grabbing its thick neck with one hand. The beast snarled, thrashing, trying to bite her. Rinka tightened her grip. She twisted. With a loud thud, the beast slammed onto the jungle floor, dazed. Rinka let out a victorious laugh. "Too slow," she muttered. The beast whined and scrambled away into the darkness. She didn't chase it. She didn't need to. It wouldn't come near her again. She turned back to the stream. But before she could take another drink, a strange scent reached her nose. Something unfamiliar. Not Acceleran. Not animal. Something new. Rinka's eyes narrowed. Then she saw him. A small figure stood at the edge of the trees, half hidden behind a thick vine. He was nothing like her kind. Short, maybe 6 feet at most, with smooth, pale skin and no claws. He wore strange clothes, and on his back he carried a metal pack with glowing lights. His brown eyes were wide as he stared at her. A human. Rinka had heard of them before. Stories told by the elders spoke of small, fragile creatures from the stars. They were weak but clever. They built machines and weapons instead of using their own strength. She had never seen one up close. Until now. The human raised his hand slowly, as if trying to show he wasn't a threat. Hello," he said in a strange, clipped accent. Rinka tilted her head. His voice was soft, uncertain. He wasn't like the others in her village who always spoke to her with caution or fear. He wasn't afraid. Interesting. She took a step closer. The human didn't run. Brave. Or foolish. Rinka crossed her arms and studied him. "You are not from here." The human blinked, surprised. "You speak my language." Rinka smirked. "The elders teach many things, even about creatures from the sky." The human exhaled, as if relieved. "I'm Miles," he said. "I'm studying your planet, your people." Rinka raised an eyebrow. "Study?" Miles nodded, then hesitated. "I saw you fight that beast," he said. "You're strong." Rinka's grin widened. "I know." Miles let out a nervous chuckle. He shifted slightly, adjusting the metal pack on his shoulders. Rinka watched every movement. He was smaller than her, weaker, but something about him was different from the others in her tribe. He didn't look at her with fear. He looked at her with curiosity. And for the first time in her life, Rinka felt something strange. She felt seen. Miles stood still, watching the massive alien woman before him. His heart pounded, but he wasn't sure if it was fear or excitement. He had studied countless alien species before, but never had he seen someone like her. The Accelerant woman, Rinka, was taller than anything he had ever encountered on two legs. Her deep blue skin shimmered slightly under the twin moons, her golden eyes glowing with intelligence. She was nothing like the fragile, delicate aliens he had met before. She looked like she could tear apart a starship with her bare hands. And yet, she wasn't attacking him. Instead, she was studying him, just as he was studying her. "You are not afraid?" Rinka asked, tilting her head slightly. Miles swallowed and shook his head. No, that wasn't entirely true. He had seen her take down a night beast in seconds. If she wanted to, she could snap him in half like a twig, but something told him she wouldn't. Rinka smirked. "Strange human." Miles chuckled nervously. "I've been called worse." He slowly unstrapped the heavy equipment pack from his back and set it on the ground. He didn't want to make any sudden moves. He had no idea how Accelerant saw human behavior. If she thought he was a threat, things could go very badly for him. Rinka crouched down slightly, resting her forearm on her knee as she continued watching him. "You say you study my people." Miles nodded. "I'm a xenobiologist. That means I study life from other planets. Your world is full of things we've never seen before. Your people, your creatures, everything here is new to us." Rinka's eyes narrowed. "New?" Miles hesitated. He had to be careful. He didn't want to insult her. "I don't mean it in a bad way," he explained quickly. "I mean, humans have been to many planets, but Celara is unique. Your kind is stronger than any species we've met before. You survive in the wild without weapons, without machines. It's incredible." Rinka let out a short laugh. "We do not need metal tools to survive. We are not weak." Miles smiled. "I can see that." Rinka looked at him for a long moment. He could tell she was thinking. Then, without warning, she stood up straight. "Come." Miles blinked. "What?" "Come," Rinka repeated, turning away. She took a few steps toward the jungle, then looked back over her shoulder. "Unless you are too slow." Miles sighed, grabbing his pack. "Oh boy, what am I getting myself into?" A walk with a giant. Miles followed Rinka into the jungle, struggling to keep up with her long strides. She moved through the dense forest, like she belonged there, stepping over fallen logs and ducking under thick vines with ease. Miles, on the other hand, had to scramble to keep up, nearly tripping every few steps. Rinka glanced back at him and smirked. "Humans are not built for this." Miles sighed. "Yeah, well, we usually rely on vehicles for this kind of thing." Rinka chuckled. "You rely on your machines too much." Miles adjusted his pack. "Maybe, but we're not as strong as you. We have to use what we have." Rinka didn't argue, but he could tell she was thinking about what he said. They continued walking until they reached a large clearing. Rinka stopped and looked around. Miles followed her gaze. The clearing was beautiful. Massive trees surrounded the open space, their thick roots twisting through the ground. The air was filled with the distant sounds of unseen creatures. A small waterfall trickled down a rock formation, creating a crystal-clear pool at the center. "What is this place?" Miles asked, breathless. Rinka crossed her arms. "My training ground." Miles frowned. "Training." Rinka stepped into the clearing and gestured to a massive stone slab lying nearby. Without effort, she crouched down, gripped the stone, and lifted it over her head. The rock had to weigh several hundred pounds, but she held it as if it were nothing. She turned to Miles, a challenge in her golden eyes. "You say humans study strength. Show me yours." Miles chuckled nervously. I don't think I can lift that." Rinka raised an eyebrow. "Then what can you do?" Miles thought for a moment. He wasn't strong like her, but he had other skills. He pulled a small handheld scanner from his pack and pointed it at the rock. The device beeped, displaying data in glowing blue letters. "This rock is about 800 pounds, Miles said. And from what I can tell, The minerals inside it are dense, which means lifting it isn't just about strength. You also need balance and control. Rinka frowned. Balance. Miles nodded. Strength alone isn't everything. If you learn how to balance your weight, you won't just be strong, you'll be unstoppable. Rinka stared at him for a moment. Then, slowly, she lowered the rock to the ground. You are small, she said, but maybe not weak. Miles grinned. I'll take that as a compliment. Rinka smirked. Good. Then tomorrow, I teach you how to fight like a Acceleran. Miles blinked. Wait. What? Rinka turned and walked away. Try to keep up, human. Miles groaned, adjusting his pack as he followed her. This is gonna hurt, isn't it? Rinka only laughed. Miles woke up to the sound of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. His body ached from the rough sleep on the jungle floor. Celara was beautiful, but it wasn't built for humans. The ground was too uneven, the air too thick with strange scents, and the nights were filled with sounds that made him wonder how many creatures were watching him while he slept. But the biggest challenge, the 10-foot-tall warrior standing over him. Rinka smirked. You sleep too much, human. Miles groaned, rubbing his eyes. It's called rest. Maybe you should try it sometime. Rinka let out a short laugh. Rest is for when you are old. Come. Miles pushed himself up, stretching his stiff muscles. You do realize humans aren't as strong as you, right? If you're planning on throwing me around like a ragdoll, I'd at least like some breakfast first. Rinka tossed a handful of bright orange fruit at him. Eat fast. Training starts now. Miles caught one of the fruits and took a cautious bite. It was surprisingly sweet. He made a mental note to record it in his research logs, if he survived today. A test of strength. Rinka led Miles back to the clearing where she had shown him her strength the night before. The giant stone slab was still there, looking as heavy as ever. You say balance is important, Rinka said, standing in the center of the clearing. Good. Then you will learn. Miles raised an eyebrow. I was talking about your balance, not mine. Rinka ignored him and pointed to a thick fallen tree trunk nearby. Stand on it. Miles sighed, but he climbed onto the trunk. It was wider than he expected, but still uneven, covered in rough bark. His legs wobbled as he struggled to keep his balance. Rinka crossed her arms. Pathetic. Miles scowled. Give me a second. Rinka suddenly stepped forward and shoved him. Not hard, at least not for her, but enough to send Miles stumbling. He barely managed to stay upright. Hey, Miles protested. What was that for? To teach you, Rinka said. The jungle does not wait for you to find your balance. It knocks you down. You must learn to stand anyway. Miles took a deep breath, focusing. He bent his knees slightly, adjusting his stance. He had been in rough environments before, hostile planets, shifting terrains, but never with an alien giant trying to knock him over. Rinka shoved him again. This time, he managed to stay on the log. She grinned. Better. For the next hour, Rinka continued testing him, pushing, shaking the log, making him jump between different points. Miles struggled at first, but little by little, he adapted. His legs burned, and sweat dripped down his face, but he refused to give up. Finally, Rinka nodded in approval. You are learning, human. Miles gasped for breath. Glad to hear it. Rinka smirked. Now we fight. Miles groaned. I knew this was coming. Strength versus strategy. Rinka stepped back and raised her arms. Attack me. Miles stared at her. That's a joke, right? You do remember I'm a human. Rinka's golden eyes gleamed. You say humans use strategy. Prove it. Miles sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He had no chance of beating her in a direct fight. But she was right about one thing. Humans relied on more than just strength. He circled her, watching her stance. She stood firm, confident. Too confident. She was used to overpowering her enemies. Maybe he could use that against her. With a quick movement, Miles picked up a handful of dirt and tossed it toward her eyes. Rinka stepped back, blinking as the dust clouded her vision. Miles used that moment to dart behind her, aiming for the back of her knees, one of the weakest points in most humanoid creatures. But Rinka was fast. Before he could land a hit, she spun around, grabbing him by the collar and lifting him off the ground. Miles groaned. Okay, bad idea. Rinka laughed and set him down. Smart move, but too slow. You rely on tricks, but tricks alone will not save you. Miles sighed. Yeah, well, I don't have 10 feet of muscle on my side. Rinka smirked. No, but you have something else. Miles looked up at her. What? She tapped her temple. A quick mind. You see openings. You think before you strike. That is rare among warriors. Miles raised an eyebrow. Was that a compliment? Rinka shrugged. Maybe. Miles dusted himself off. So, do I pass your test? Rinka considered him for a moment. Then she grinned. You survive. For now. A growing bond. The sun was starting to set by the time they returned to their resting spot. Miles collapsed onto the ground, exhausted. Remind me never to challenge you to a fight again. Rinka sat beside him, stretching her arms. You did better than I expected. Miles looked up at the sky, the 2 moons shining brightly. Why are you helping me, anyway? Rinka was silent for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice quieter than before. You do not fear me. Miles turned his head toward her. Should I? She didn't answer right away. My people fear my strength. They call me wild, untamed. Even my own tribe does not trust me. Miles frowned. That's their loss. Strength isn't just about power. It's about how you use it. Rinka looked at him, something unreadable in her golden eyes. Perhaps. Miles smiled. Well, for what it's worth, I think you're incredible. Rinka raised an eyebrow. Do not flatter me, human. Miles chuckled. I mean it. You're the strongest warrior I've ever met, and I think your tribe is wrong about you. Rinka stared at him for a long moment. Then, to Miles' surprise, she smiled. A real smile. Maybe you are not so weak after all, Miles. Miles grinned. Glad you're finally seeing it. Rinka chuckled and leaned back against a tree. Miles followed her gaze to the stars above. He had come to Xilora expecting to study the planet. Instead, he had found something far more interesting, a warrior who was more than what her people believed her to be. And maybe, just maybe, she had found something in him too. Miles woke up to a sharp poke on his shoulder. Up. Rinka's voice rumbled above him. He groaned, rolling over on the hard jungle floor. 5 more minutes. Another poke, harder this time. Get up, human. The jungle does not wait for the weak. Miles sighed and sat up, rubbing his eyes. You really enjoy making me suffer, don't you? Rinka smirked. You need it. It had been 3 days since Miles met Rinka, and each day had been more exhausting than the last. She had pushed him beyond anything he thought possible, forcing him to climb, balance, dodge, and fight. He was sore in places he didn't know existed, but strangely, he didn't hate it. Maybe because, for the first time in his life, he wasn't just an observer. He was part of something. He stood, stretching his stiff muscles. So, what's today's torture session? Rinka tilted her head. Today, you teach me. Miles blinked. Wait, what? Rinka crossed her arms. You say strength is not enough. You say strategy and control matter. Show me. Miles hesitated. He had studied alien biology, survival tactics, and even hand-to-hand combat, but teaching a 10-foot-tall warrior how to fight smarter. That was a challenge he wasn't sure he was ready for. Still, he couldn't back down now. All right, he said, rubbing his hands together. Let's start with something simple. Strength without control is nothing. Miles picked up a small rock from the ground. Let's talk about power versus precision. Rinka raised an eyebrow. I do not need lessons on power. Exactly, Miles said. But what happens when power isn't enough? She frowned. Miles pointed to a thick tree trunk about 20 feet away. Throw this rock at it. Rinka scoffed. Easy. She took the rock, pulled back her arm, and hurled it with incredible force. The rock smashed into the tree, splintering the bark. Birds scattered from the branches, startled by the impact. Miles nodded. Okay. Now hit that small fruit hanging from the branch next to it. Rinka glanced at the tiny orange fruit, no bigger than Miles' fist. She picked up another rock and threw it, hard. The rock zipped past the fruit, missing completely. Rinka scowled. The rock is too large. Miles grinned. No. The throw was too strong. You rely on force, not aim. Rinka narrowed her eyes. She picked up a smaller stone and tried again, but the result was the same. The rock flew past the fruit, too fast and uncontrolled. Miles crossed his arms. See, strength is good, but if you don't control it, it's wasted. Rinka was silent for a moment. Then she nodded. Show me. Miles picked up a pebble, weighing it in his hand. He took a deep breath, focused, and flicked his wrist. The pebble zipped through the air and struck the fruit, knocking it loose from the branch. Rinka's eyes widened slightly. Miles smirked. Precision. She exhaled and picked up another pebble. This time, she threw it with less force, adjusting her aim. The first attempt missed, but the second hit its mark, knocking another fruit to the ground. Rinka grinned. Interesting. Miles chuckled. Told you. A lesson in patience. They spent the next few hours practicing different techniques, balancing power and precision, controlling speed, and even using the environment to their advantage. Rinka was a fast learner, adapting quickly to every new concept. But there was one thing she struggled with. Patience. You rush too much, Miles said as Rinka missed another careful throw. You're used to overwhelming your opponent, but sometimes the best move is waiting for the right moment. Rinka sighed. Waiting is weakness. Miles shook his head. No, waiting is strategy. Let me show you. He led her to a shaded part of the jungle, where a small four-legged creature with spotted fur was hunting. The creature crouched low in the grass, completely still. It was waiting. Then, in an instant, it pounced, catching an insect in its jaws. Rinka watched, her expression unreadable. See, Miles said. It didn't attack right away. It waited. Then, when the time was right, it struck. Rinka nodded slowly. I see. They returned to the clearing, and this time, she tried again, waiting before throwing, reading the movement of the target. When she finally released the stone, it hit the fruit dead center. Miles grinned. Now you're getting it. Rinka smirked. You are not completely useless, human. Miles chuckled. I'll take that as a compliment. A warrior's doubt. As the sun set, they sat by the stream, resting. You learn quickly, Miles said. Rinka stared at the water, her expression unreadable. I have had to. Miles frowned. Because of your tribe. She exhaled. They do not understand me. I am stronger, wilder than them. They see me as too much. Miles nodded. But strength isn't bad. Rinka looked at him. They do not believe that. Miles sighed. He had seen it before, people being pushed aside for being different, for not fitting into what others expected. They're wrong, he said. Rinka studied him for a moment. You believe that? Miles smiled. I know that. Rinka was silent for a while. Then she nodded. Maybe you are right. Miles sat cross-legged on the ground, watching the fire crackle between him and Rinka. The jungle night was alive with distant sounds, chirping insects, rustling leaves, and the occasional deep growl of some unseen predator. It had been a long day of training, and his body ached in ways he didn't think were possible. Rinka, however, looked completely at ease. The massive alien woman sat with her arms resting on her knees, golden eyes fixed on the flames. Miles exhaled. So, be honest. Am I the worst student you've ever had? Rinka smirked. You are weak, slow, and clumsy. Miles groaned. Great. Thanks for the confidence boost. She chuckled. But you learn. And that is more than I can say for many in my tribe. Miles raised an eyebrow. Your people don't like to learn. Rinka's expression darkened slightly. They do not see the need. They believe strength is enough. That brute force will always win. I was raised to believe this too. But I have always questioned it. Miles leaned forward. And they don't like that. Rinka shook her head. No. They call me wild, untamed. They think I am reckless because I do not follow their ways without question. Miles frowned. He had suspected something like this, but hearing it directly from her made it clear. Rinka wasn't just different because of her strength. She was different because she thought differently. I don't think you're reckless, he said. You're just looking for something more. Rinka tilted her head. More. Miles gestured at the jungle around them. More than just survival. More than just fighting for the sake of fighting. Rinka was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded. Perhaps. The call of the jungle. The next morning, Miles was woken not by Rinka poking him, but by a deep, distant roar that sent a chill down his spine. His eyes shot open. What was that? Rinka was already standing, her muscles tense, a beast of the jungle. Miles scrambled to his feet. That thing sounded huge. Rinka nodded. It is. And it is close. Miles glanced around, suddenly feeling very small. Should we, I don't know, run? Rinka gave him a sharp look. You cannot outrun a jungle beast. You must stand your ground. Miles gulped. That sounds like something that gets people killed. Rinka smirked. Only if they are weak. Before Miles could argue, the bushes nearby shook violently. A massive creature stepped into view, a hulking, four-legged predator with dark scales and glowing yellow eyes. It was easily twice the size of a human, with long claws that looked sharp enough to slice through metal. Miles instinctively stepped back. Okay, that's officially the scariest thing I've ever seen. Rinka, however, didn't flinch. She stepped forward, standing tall, her posture strong and unshaken. Watch, human. The beast growled, lowering its body as if preparing to pounce. But Rinka didn't react with fear. Instead, she locked eyes with it, her expression steady. Then, to Miles' shock, she let out a deep, rumbling growl of her own. The beast froze. Miles stared. Are you seriously growling at it? Rinka didn't answer. She simply held her ground. The beast let out another snarl, but this time it hesitated. It shifted its weight, muscles tensing as if uncertain. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it turned and slinked back into the jungle. Miles released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That was the craziest thing I've ever seen. Rinka turned to him, a small smirk on her lips. Fear is a weapon. If you show weakness, you are prey. If you show strength, you are not worth the fight. Miles shook his head in disbelief. You stared down a monster and made it back down. I don't know if that's brave or just insane. Rinka chuckled. Perhaps both. Trust and survival. As they walked through the jungle, Miles couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. You knew that thing would back down, he asked. Rinka shrugged. Not for certain. But I knew I had to act as if I did. Miles frowned. And if it had attacked? Rinka's smirk didn't fade. Then we would be running, human. Miles laughed. Great. Glad you had a backup plan. They continued through the dense trees until they reached a small river. Rinka knelt down, scooping up water in her hands and drinking. Miles followed her lead, splashing the cool water on his face. So, what now? Rinka looked at him. You survived my lessons. You are learning. Miles raised an eyebrow. You almost sound impressed. She smirked. Almost. Miles sighed, shaking his head. I don't get you, Rinka. One moment, you're acting like I'm a weak little creature, and the next, you're teaching me how to fight and survive. Rinka's expression softened slightly. Because you are different from other humans I have seen. You do not run. You do not complain. You do not fear me. Miles hesitated. Should I? Rinka looked at him for a long moment. Then she shook her head. No. Miles smiled. Good. Because honestly, I think you're kinda awesome. Rinka chuckled. Flattery will not make training easier, human. Miles groaned. I was afraid you'd say that. The storm approaches. As they prepared to move on, the sky above darkened. Thick clouds rolled in, and a low rumble of thunder echoed through the jungle. Rinka looked up. A storm is coming. Miles frowned. That's bad, right? Rinka nodded. The storms here are strong. We must find shelter. Miles glanced around. Where? Rinka pointed toward the cliffs in the distance. There. Come. Miles followed as she led the way, but something about the air felt off. The jungle was too quiet. The animals had gone still. Then suddenly, a sound broke the silence. Not thunder, not wind. Voices. Miles tensed. We're not alone, are we? Rinka's expression hardened. No, they weren't facing that jungle beast this time. They were facing something far more dangerous. The jungle was too quiet. Miles had spent enough time on Solara to know that silence was never a good sign. The usual rustling of leaves, distant calls of creatures, and hum of insects had vanished. Something was out there. Watching. Waiting. Rinka's golden eyes scanned the dense foliage. Her muscles were tense, ready for a fight. Stay close, human, she said in a low voice. Miles swallowed hard. Any idea who, or what, we're dealing with? Rinka nodded grimly. My people. Miles blinked. Wait, your people? The same ones who think you're too wild. Rinka's jaw tightened. Yes. A rustling sound came from the trees ahead. Shadows moved between the thick trunks. Miles instinctively crouched lower. What do they want? Rinka's expression was unreadable. To bring me back, or to remove me. Miles frowned. Wait, remove you? You mean? Before he could finish, a deep voice echoed through the jungle. Rinka. A tall, broad-shouldered Celeran warrior stepped into view. He was almost as massive as Rinka, his dark blue skin marked with tribal scars. More figures appeared behind him, at least 5 others, all armed with long spears and stone-bladed knives. The leader took another step forward. You have been gone too long. The elders demand your return. Rinka didn't move. I do not follow their demands. The warrior's eyes narrowed. You disgrace our people. You waste your strength. And now, you stand beside a human. His gaze shifted to Miles, filled with disgust. This is how low you have fallen. Miles raised his hands. Standing beside is a strong word. More like hiding behind. Rinka didn't smile. She stepped forward, her voice cold. I choose my own path. Varrock. Varrock's expression hardened. You were meant to be a warrior. Instead, you run in the jungle like a wild beast. You are dangerous. Miles muttered under his breath. Takes one to know one. Rinka's hands clenched into fists. I am stronger than any of you. And that frightens you. Varrock's grip tightened on his spear. You are outnumbered, Rinka. You cannot win this fight. Miles leaned toward her. Rinka, maybe this is one of those strategy over strength moments. Rinka exhaled sharply. We do not run. Great, Miles muttered. Of course we don't. The battle begins. Without warning, one of the warriors lunged forward, aiming a spear at Rinka's side. She moved like lightning, twisting her body to avoid the strike. With a single, powerful motion, she grabbed the spear shaft and yanked the warrior off his feet, sending him crashing into the dirt. Another warrior charged, swinging a heavy club. Rinka ducked under the blow and delivered a brutal elbow to his chest, knocking the air from his lungs. Miles, meanwhile, had exactly zero plans for fighting a group of alien warriors. As one of them rushed toward him, he did the only thing that made sense. He ran. "Yep, nope, not doing this," he shouted as he darted behind a tree. The warrior chased him, but Miles was smaller, faster. He ducked under a low-hanging branch, then grabbed a handful of dirt and flung it into the warrior's face. The accelerant stumbled, momentarily blinded. "Hey, that actually worked," Miles said, surprised. Then another warrior came at him from the side. "Oh, come on." Miles dodged, barely avoiding a swinging blade. He had no weapon, no strength to match theirs. But he had his mind. He spotted a large tree root sticking out of the ground. As the warrior charged again, Miles sidestepped at the last second. The accelerant's foot caught on the root, sending him sprawling face-first into the dirt. Miles grinned. Gotta love gravity. Strength and strategy. Rinka was a whirlwind of motion. She fought with controlled fury, her strikes powerful but precise. But there were too many of them. Varrock, seeing an opening, struck. His spear caught Rinka's side, drawing a thin line of blood. She hissed in pain but didn't fall. Instead, she grabbed the spear and snapped it in half with her bare hands. "You should have brought more warriors," she growled. Varrock snarled and swung a fist at her, but Rinka dodged, then slammed her palm into his chest, sending him stumbling backward. Miles, still catching his breath, called out, not to interrupt. But we might want to end this before more of them show up." Rinka nodded. She turned back to Varrock, who was glaring at her, breathing heavily. "You will never belong," he spat. Rinka's eyes narrowed. "Then I will make my own place." She grabbed him by the arm and threw him into the nearest tree. The impact shook the branches, and Varrock crumpled to the ground, dazed. The remaining warriors hesitated. They looked at their leader, then at Rinka. She didn't move, her golden eyes daring them to continue. One by one, the warriors backed away, grabbing Varrock and dragging him to his feet. "This is not over," Varrock growled. Rinka crossed her arms. "Yes, it is." Varrock glared at her for a moment longer before turning and disappearing into the jungle with his warriors. Miles let out a shaky breath. "Well, that was fun." Rinka looked at him, her expression softer than before. "You fought well, human." Miles scoffed. "I ran well. There's a difference." Rinka smirked. "Running is a strategy." Miles chuckled. "I'm gonna pretend you meant that as a compliment." A new path. As they sat by the fire that night, Miles glanced at Rinka's side, where the spear had grazed her. "You okay?" She nodded. "It is nothing." Miles sighed. "So, what now? Your people aren't just gonna let this go." Rinka was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at him. "I will not run from them. But I will not return to them, either. I will decide my own fate." Miles smiled. "Sounds like a good plan." Rinka smirked. "And you? Will you run?" Miles exhaled. "I think I've done enough running for today." Rinka chuckled. "Good." They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire flicker. The jungle was no longer silent. The sounds of life had returned. The fight wasn't over. But they weren't backing down. The jungle was alive again. The sounds of insects, distant roars, and rustling leaves filled the air as if nature itself had acknowledged Rinka's victory. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows on the rocky walls of the small cave where Miles and Rinka had taken shelter. Miles stretched his sore muscles and winced. "Okay, remind me never to fight your people again." Rinka, sitting beside him, smirked. "You survived. That is more than most can say." Miles groaned. Yeah, but barely. My fighting style is just don't die. Rinka chuckled. A good strategy. Miles shook his head, amused. So, what happens now? They'll come back, right? Rinka's golden eyes flickered with thought. Varrock is proud. He will not admit defeat easily. He may return with more warriors. Miles frowned. So we're not safe here. Rinka exhaled. No, but I have made my choice. I will not run. A dangerous path. Morning came with a heavy mist hanging over the jungle. Miles and Rinka moved carefully through the trees, knowing they couldn't stay in one place for too long. As they walked, Miles noticed something different in Rinka. She wasn't just moving through the jungle like before. She was thinking, planning. You have a plan, don't you? Miles asked. Rinka nodded. I must face them, not as they expect, but on my terms. Miles raised an eyebrow. Okay, and what does that mean? Rinka stopped and turned to him. I will challenge Varrock. A final fight. If I win, they will leave me be. Miles blinked. Wait, just you. What happened to teamwork? Rinka smirked. This is not your fight, human. Miles crossed his arms. Like that's ever stopped me before. Rinka's smirk faded slightly. If I lose, they will take me back. Or worse. Miles' stomach twisted. Then don't lose. Rinka nodded. I do not plan to. The final challenge. They didn't have to wait long. By midday, the jungle went silent again. Miles and Rinka stepped into a wide clearing where the ground was hard and dry. No trees to hide behind, no escape routes. Waiting for them was Varrock and a dozen warriors. Varrock stepped forward. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with challenge. You return, Rinka. Have you come to surrender? Rinka shook her head. I have come to end this. Varrock smirked. Brave words. But words do not win battles. Rinka took a step closer. Then fight me. You and me. No weapons, no interference. Varrock's smirk faded. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Very well. Miles tensed as the warriors formed a circle around them, sealing them inside. This is a terrible idea, Miles muttered. Rinka stepped forward, rolling her shoulders. Stay back, human. Miles sighed. Like I have a choice. The battle for freedom. The fight began in an instant. Varrock lunged first, his fist swinging toward Rinka's face. She dodged, twisting her body and delivering a sharp elbow to his ribs. Varrock grunted but didn't fall. He countered with a brutal strike to her side, hitting the wound from their last battle. Rinka stumbled slightly, but she didn't let the pain stop her. She struck back, slamming her palm against Varrock's chest and forcing him backward. The warriors around them shouted in excitement, but Miles could barely breathe. This wasn't just a fight, it was a war of will. Varrock charged again, grabbing Rinka and trying to throw her to the ground. She planted her feet, muscles straining, and lifted him instead. With a fierce cry, she slammed him down. The ground shook. Varrock coughed, struggling to rise, but Rinka was already moving. She grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him down. I am not weak, she growled. I am not wild. I am stronger than you because I choose to be. Varrock struggled, his breathing ragged. But he knew. He had lost. Enough, he spat. You have won. Rinka released him and stepped back, standing tall. The warriors watched in silence. Then, one by one, they lowered their heads in respect. Miles blinked. Did we just win? Rinka looked at Varrock. You will leave me be. Varrock met her gaze, then nodded. You have earned your place. I will not challenge you again. Without another word, he stood and signaled to his warriors. They disappeared into the jungle, leaving Rinka and Miles alone. A new beginning. Miles let out a long breath. That was the most intense thing I have ever seen. Rinka turned to him, her golden eyes calm. It is over. Miles grinned. So, what now? Rinka looked up at the sky, thinking. Now, I am free. Miles chuckled. And what does a free Celeran warrior do? Rinka smirked. She decides her own path. Miles raised an eyebrow. And does that path involve throwing me into the mud again? Rinka chuckled. Perhaps. Miles groaned. Great, just what I needed. Rinka looked at him, something new in her expression. You have fought beside me, Miles. You are no longer just a human. You are a warrior. Miles blinked. Whoa, that's probably the coolest thing anyone's ever said to me. Rinka turned toward the jungle. Come, human. There is much more to see. Miles followed, shaking his head with a smile. You know, for a 10-foot-tall warrior, you're not so bad. Rinka smirked. Neither are you. As they disappeared into the jungle, the adventure was far from over. But for the first time, Rinka walked not as an outcast, but as someone who had truly chosen her own fate.